Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next Future Leaders Group OpenUK training session, lunchtime training session. Thank you for joining us today, and I'll give you a little bit of introduction as to what the Future Leaders Group of OpenUK is. We're a collection of individuals who are interested in open technologies, including open source software, open hardware, and open data. It includes a wide range of people that work in technology, IP, outsourcing, procurement, data, coding, and innovation, and includes both private practice lawyers and in-house counsel that work in the technology sector and related fields. We operate under the direction of OpenUK's Legal and Policy Committee to bring together and develop future leaders in legal and policy matters relating to open tech, and to support and further the mission of the Legal and Policy Committee. My name is Robert Brunels, and I'm one of the co-chairs along with Katie Gibson. I'm from Phil Fisher and Katie's from Bristow's, and we're both lawyers advising on technology and commercial matters. The group is always open to new ideas and to new members, whether they're getting involved in all of our activities such as these and others, or just dipping in and out of our various projects. And without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Amanda Brock, CEO of OpenUK, to introduce our speaker for today.
Thanks very much, Rob, and thank you everybody who's come along today and everybody who's watching this later on a download. It's a great honour today to introduce, I'm going to say an OpenUK board member, but of course better known as Executive Director of the GNOME Foundation, long-term contributor, over 15 years of contribution to the Debian desktop project, which he's going to talk all about today. And most recently in the news as the leader of GNOME at the time when the GNOME Foundation was subject to patent aggression, not just leading to a settlement for GNOME, but leading to a settlement which really has benefited the whole open source community, and which in our last talk 10, I believe, Keith Burgell referenced in a bit more detail. So a bit of a hero at the moment, Neil, but without further ado, or more of an introduction, I'm going to pass over to you to talk to us today about the Open Desktop. I think we're going to wait for questions at the end, but people will put them in the chat as we go. And we will probably, unless you want some cams left on, take them down.
Thanks very much for the intro. Yeah, so I wanted to give a quick introduction to sort of the Open Desktop and where we've been trying to drive things. So a bit of history of a bit of walkthrough of where we came from, and then the sort of challenges that we're facing today with trying to push more open source on the desktop, and then a little bit of look into some future predictions or some trends which we're seeing, which we need to be wary of. So just a look into kind of the past and where we came from. So in the 1980s or so, you essentially had large mainframes from IBM. You were allowed to book time on those, and you had a system administrator that allowed you to use their system through your terminal if you were lucky. And that meant that it really wasn't an era where personal computing and people could be in control of their own computing. Additionally, things were very expensive or just purely not accessible, and you had to pay quite a lot of money to access computing. And then in about 1993, one of the projects that I've been involved with for the longest time came along. It's called Debian. And Debian, the operating system, the distribution, it wasn't just a way of accessing computing and allowing people to use it, but it was something very unique and very new. It was a way of people from all over the world coming together and creating something for free. It really showed the sort of power of communities, and how when people were able to come together like that, you could produce this new way of working and produce this fantastic thing that people could use. But still around that time, people weren't really catching on to it. This was the days where essentially Windows on the desktop was ruling everything. Your internet browser choice was essentially Internet Explorer, or for some cases Netscape Navigator, but the vast majority was there. And so there was a view that, okay, so we need to do something on the desktop, something that allows for a fully free and open system to be used. And so in 1997, Miguel Gaza and Federico Mena created what was then known as the GNU Network Object Model Environment, and is now called GNOME. And so for the past 20 years or so, we've been trying to push ahead and try and ensure that people are able to have control of their own computing and have an open desktop. And organizations were starting to notice and starting to kind of understand that this free software thing is something that's happening, and it could be a bit of a force within the software industry, but they didn't really understand it too well. In the 11th of February in 2000, CNN published this headline: "Opinion, is free software communist?" People simply didn't understand that this concept of all these people coming together and doing something for everyone for free would be something that's possible to do. I guess my personal history, before we kind of move on to the present day, might be kind of useful. I first started free software about 20 years ago now. I was introduced to it by a friend who had a decent internet connection and downloaded CDs of Linux distributions and started selling them to his friends at school. I originally then, my first distribution I installed was Mandriva at university there, but then quickly moved on to Debian. My initial one there was packaging a package called Drivel, which was a live journal client for people who remember that, before we called it blogging. And then I kind of got involved with various bits and pieces. I helped set up the testing security team. I was the Debian release manager for about 6 years, I believe. And then I ended up being Debian Project Leader for a while. Eventually, through various open source jobs, I then ended up as my current position as the executive director of the GNOME Foundation, and really trying to push the things that the GNOME project find important. And I would like to just point out that the reach of GNOME and what we do goes far beyond just GNOME as a desktop. The amount of things and systems we produced to be able to have that integrated, easy to use, streamlined desktop is quite incredible, and you find GNOME technologies all over the place. So whether you're running a Kubernetes cluster in the cloud to pretty much any desktop system, you are using GNOME software. I believe libxml2 was originally a GNOME software, so anything that parses XML uses our stuff. And so hundreds of other things. And we're really essentially trying to put software into the hands of end users. So looking back from that original comment from CNN, there's been a meteoric rise in free software use and in open source. I believe it was Alibaba or in China who recently had a study of open source software, and their estimates was that they believe that over 90% of all software running now is open source. So great. So we've won, right? But this utopia that we've come to want for the future of open source is here. I mean, we've seen the use of Linux in Internet of Things, in mobile computing, in servers. I believe when I was Debian Project Leader, there was a tweet congratulating us on our latest release and saying that at Linux Fest Northwest they would be putting on a party with cupcakes to celebrate the latest release, and that tweet was from Microsoft themselves. And it's not just that rise of the software, but of those communities themselves. And yet somehow it doesn't feel like we've won and that the world is in that utopia. Another thing that organizations have found is this model of this distributed development that has come out. The ability for globally diverse people to come together and contribute on a system and a project. And lots of organizations are starting to see this and starting to decide that you can work across time zones and across cultures and be able to bring in that fantastic distributed model. This is obviously a thing from Slack. And they are starting to understand this is concept of where work happens and wherever work means for you, but they're not quite understanding it yet. This advert is absolutely right. So Slack is available and it allows people to work remotely and collaborate remotely, except if you want to work for Slack. In that case, you need to relocate to San Francisco. So starting to get there, but not quite. So what is the next thing for desktop GNU Linux, the open desktop? Where are we? In an age where more and more things get pushed into the cloud, what's the real relevance if everything's in a web browser? I would say that in certain areas, it is even more imperative that we care about things. As I mentioned, free software is coming to be successful in many areas, from automotive to healthcare and even in your toaster. I had to have my dishwasher replaced recently, and opening up the manual, it came with the usual, here's your different settings, here's where you put your dishwasher tablets, and then at the back it came a copy with the GNU GPL, because it has free software running its little displays in it. And it's fantastic, but who cares if your dishwasher is running GPL software if there's no user freedoms behind it? Now, just to move on to future, I want to preface this with I am terrible at predicting the future. When the iPad first came out in 2010 as one of the first tablet devices, I had a look at it and I kind of dismissed it. To me, it looked like a massive phone which couldn't make phone calls. And so I thought there would be no chance that it would ever take off, and yet here we are. So instead of predicting the future, here's an anti-prediction. People have said the desktop is dead, and I disagree. In a few key areas, it is even more important that people are able to keep control over their own computing. Particularly if people require wins for accessibility, for privacy, and for those fundamental freedoms which people want to use their computing for. I want to ensure that those freedoms and that open desktop is available for everyone. I don't believe that if somebody happens to be blind, they should have to use proprietary systems or give up their data to be able to access their computing. Or if you simply can't afford a fast internet connection. In Indonesia, for example, a 50 megabyte monthly cap can be a quarter of someone's monthly wages. And if you've ever tried to install Windows 10 without an internet connection, you'll see how incredibly limited it can be. I think even the version of Paint requires an internet connection so it can save to Microsoft's OneDrive. And this is just not good enough. We have 2/3 of the world who don't have access to computing at all. And the use of GNOME and free software on the desktop is going to change that. So a slightly more bleak future that we have. Nowadays, I think, particularly in times of COVID, we're seeing more and more clamours from governments to control our data and to ensure that they are the ones who are able to control that and tell you what you can do with your own computing. And this has been going on for many years, from Home Secretaries saying they want to break encryption to people saying it's like, yes, but this is incredibly important in these times, but of course we'll be fine with all the data afterwards. And of course, governments never lose your data. And the impact on this is not just your desktop. It is every phone, every Internet of Things device, every self-driving car. And it's not just governments. It is any for-profit company. This, of course, many people will remember as the Cambridge Analytica logo. The use of proprietary software and the use of proprietary systems ensures that you can't control your own computing. If we allow proprietary software to continue to be used in this way, then things like Cambridge Analytica will come to pass. So, on that slightly grim note, what's next? How can we prevent this? For me, it's about putting software back into the hands of free users and ensuring that those users have that control. And there's many people who are working really hard to make sure this happens. An example of how you could get involved with GNOME and ensuring that people are in control of their own computing is here. There's a simple guide for how to get involved with the project and kind of how to get started. It's called our Newcomers Initiative, and it's something that we want help from anyone out there who's able to come and help with this. Also, perhaps we don't have the best answers here. So about a month and a half ago, we launched the Community Engagement Challenge. This is a challenge where we accept that we just perhaps do not have all the answers. We don't know how to get people involved with open software. It's something we've been trying for years and years, and I think every project around the world has struggled to find sufficient volunteers and sufficient people to help carry on with their project and help maintain their projects. So we're reaching out to anyone with an idea of how to get people involved with software. And there's some money behind this as well. So this is something that we're running to anyone who has an idea or has a project about how to get people involved with open source software in general. So if you have a look at gnome.org/challenge, there's loads of details on there. There's money to be won. Applications are due in by the end of the month for the first phase. So have a look at there and try and come up with your ideas on how to get involved with free software. Just a quick plug for, as I mentioned earlier, we had a mention of the patent case, which went on. I'm going to be doing a talk with the Society for Computers and Law on Thursday, 25th of June at 3 p.m. That's scl.org, and we're going to be running through some with some lawyers there about the kind of details of the case and having a quick run through that. So if you wanted more information about that, then that's certainly available. Secondly, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming along and listening to the talk. I will be taking some questions, and then hopefully then we can and be able to answer as many of those as I can. I just wanted to sort of kind of wrap up with saying that I don't think that bleak future which we had is something that will come to pass, as long as we are all able to carry on contributing together with open data, open hardware, and open software, and making sure we're able to continually collaborate so that we can achieve that promise that we've made, that that you can be in control of your own computing. So whether it is that you have that trust in your self-driving car that takes your kids to school, or that your medical device there has actually been audited properly and you can see how it works, and the bugs are being able to be seen by everyone, or that, yes, your toaster won't crash when it makes you toast in the morning, then that's something that we can all do together. So thanks very much, and hopefully there's some questions.
Thanks, Neil. It's really interesting. You obviously, having worked for 5 years for a distro on a sort of formal basis, you make me think about a lot of different things in the talk. I remember being in Canonical and a trading standards officer coming to me with Ubuntu disks. Mm-hmm. I guess they don't do disks anymore, but back in the day, everything went through a disk, and you're making me think about disks. They came to us with it because they were selling them in a market, and clearly thought they were breaching our rights because they didn't understand the difference between free and open source software and proprietary software. And I'm afraid I sent them back to them and said, good luck. If they can sell them, let them. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about the request for contribution? It's interesting to hear that GNOME wants more people involved, but in what ways can we help groups like this?
Yeah. So is that the challenge or the...
Well, actually, the challenge is interesting. I'm going off to look at the challenge because it's slightly different from what I thought it was, and actually there may be room for us to apply. But I also, that general call for people to get involved, I think it's interesting. What can we do?
That one is this one.
Yeah.
So that site. So GNOME is always after, like all free software projects are always after more people. So it could be coding, documentation, marketing, translation. So GNOME, for example, is translated into over 80 languages. So we really are a worldwide global project. And so there's testing, design, system administration, more stuff that people can get involved. However, one thing I would urge people to do is, if not GNOME, then find something you're using, any project, and just get involved. I will guarantee you that there are not enough people in that project for the amount of work that there is to be done. This is a problem which all of free software is and open source software struggles from. There's not enough people to maintain what we have, and that's why often very difficult decisions have to be made about what we're going to support and how we're going to do it. There just simply isn't the number of hours and to get involved, or indeed often the money to do so. So relying on those volunteers' effort is something that all free software projects need. So find something that you use or something that you care about and get stuck in.
And I think it's interesting, you're sort of in some ways, at least with the audience who's watching you live, preaching to the converted, because everybody here is active in our groups. I think scanning through that list, they're all on the Legal and Policy group or Future Leaders group. So they're actively involved with various lobbying or creating documentation to help to explain open source. One of the things we've been working on this week is working with also the Conservatory in Europe, redrafting and working with them collaboratively to create the guide to the UK public sector's open source rules, you know, what the legislation and stuff is. So a lot of people here have been working on that. The future leaders are actually undertaking a review of public sector procurement terms and processes. So helping to make sure that projects like GNOME, Debian get into the public sector, which is always a difficult one. Rob, you've pinged up, but does that mean you have a question?
No specific question. You actually stole my question about the getting involved. And I was saying that documentation is probably always something that always gets overlooked, I think, in open source projects. It's not as sexy as doing the coding, I think, for a lot of people. And potentially with the audience we have here who'd like to write long contracts and long agreements and lots of documentation, it's probably quite a thing that might chime well with people. So yeah, I was going to say, yeah, is that the sort of thing you envisage getting people involved who are not necessarily software engineers? So
yeah, absolutely. GNOME has for a long time really welcomed everyone who's not just software engineers along. It's something we're really keen to do. I think with this year we're involved in the Google season of docs as well to try and improve some of the documentation and things like that. And even if not that, then marketing is a fantastic use as well. As if you have a look at a lot of open source software projects, you'll see that their websites are not the best designed in the world, and their marketing isn't great. So yeah, being involved with ideas of everywhere from designers, documentation, or things like that is the traditional one where we've struggled.
It's something that as like as someone trying to get and use more and more open source software, sort of trying to deploy it myself to try and learn how to use it and see how it works as well. But like you realize as a beginner, the documentation, even if it's friendly for people who really know what they're doing, it's definitely not always beginner friendly. And I think also like realizing how to improve the documentation really comes from trying it and failing and then saying I need help and then documenting exactly what you need to do. So I don't know if anyone else feels that, but yeah.
And I think it's interesting to understand with the desktop, you know, the desktop's not dead, but also the interaction between the operating systems and the cloud. Maybe it would also be helpful because a lot of the people involved in this series of talks and training have a background where they've covered some aspect of open. And one of the things, Neil, that we're always being asked is how do you pull all that together? How do they learn about how it all works? So I think what you've explained is great on the desktop, but those same distros are sitting under the cloud. I'm being a bit naughty here to ask you to go off topic, but would you be comfortable talking a little bit about how the distros fit into the cloud environment as well?
Yeah, sure. So this is certainly something that I think a number of the distributions in the past have struggled with of how you fit into a cloud environment. But it was, I think, quite telling that I think that it's becoming more and more important for a Linux distribution to run well in cloud environments. I think it was Azure, the Microsoft public cloud, is now the vast majority of it runs Linux, which is something that was amazing compared with years ago. And we have huge industries now that are being pulled up to fit into the cloud. So you have Google's compute platform, you have AWS, you have Azure and things like that. And although it is fantastic, I think that we are seeing this mass adoption of Linux around, it's still worrying in a way for me. I see, I mean, from a desktop point of view, I see people using free software in the cloud, producing free software and running it in Kubernetes, and using other free software and then releasing it to GPL, and they're all doing it on a Mac. and the hoops you have to jump through to get a Linux system running on a Mac is incredible compared with actually just running a Linux system. And so that's something I think that we need to address as well. I mean, specifically on the cloud, as I mentioned before, we've got all this software running in the cloud. Great. What does that mean for that user? How does that affect that user's control over their own computing? What does it mean? I mean, fantastic. Okay, so we have this thing written in GTK using a GPL license, and it's all fantastic. And that's a thing that's being used to send your personal data to Facebook to monetize you. Where is people's control over their own computing? And so I do think that there's fantastic things we are seeing, like of governments, especially in Europe, to consider the use of people's data and ensuring that people's data remains open and remains in control of their own computing. I mean, this is one of the problems we have with this concept of everything just goes to Google or just goes to Facebook. Is this is a return to that 1980s style of computing with mainframes and terminals. Instead of having a mainframe and a terminal, you now have a cloud and a web browser, and you have someone else who's saying how you're allowed to use your own computing. And that is something that's a worry for me of how we're able to do that. And we have seen pushback on that, I think, a lot since the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Things like data privacy, and people are starting to care about it. I realize that actually it has been a bit of a turning point for people when I think my dad mentioned to me, he's always cared about not using Facebook because I told him not to about 10 years ago or so, and he never did, and actually cared about his data privacy. But he said all his golfing friends mentioned about data privacy and breaches from Cambridge Analytica. So this is something that is starting to get through to people, that people should care about the use of the cloud. But more precisely, it's how it fits in with your data and what's happening to it. It's about being in control of your own computing, and not just outsourcing it to everyone else.
I think that's really interesting, Neil, because I think there's sort of two aspects there, right? What you focused on is the data, but there's also, and I don't know how this is going to evolve, a debt that each and every one of us probably has, in that we use cloud or platform-based tools constantly. And sitting under those, almost everything is open, right? Not just the infrastructure, but the OS that's been running there. That total cost to the enterprise and total cost to the individual is something that would be really nice to understand a bit better. Do you know of anything where people are starting to look at that, find a way of identifying it?
Yeah, so there's a particular one off the top of my head. There's a thing called Tidelift, which is looking at the ability to try and work out how much of your software stack is, how it relies on open source software. I think there is a little bit more recognition that these large enterprises and this huge amount of money that's floating around is not going back to those open source projects that are supporting it. This was particularly highlighted when Heartbleed came along, and we suddenly realized that, oh, it's like 3 people are maintaining OpenSSL in their spare time and for free, and that's it. And the entire of the internet relies on this, and it's all broken, and there's just no money. It's starting in a few areas, it's starting to get a little bit better, but there is still a huge amount of funding that's required and needs to go in. And I think it's incumbent on venture capitalists to ask those questions when they're looking at Series A funding rounds, is to speak to those startups and say, okay, so you're relying on this technology stack, but you're not paying for it and you don't have any support for it. How do you know it's not going to go away tomorrow? What are you doing to support your underlying technologies? Because otherwise you're just building on a potentially a house of cards. How can we make sure that basically when investments happen, that people look at that? And I think it is also incumbent on those startups as well to try and make sure that when they receive funding, that their product that they're hoping to build it has that firm base. And it doesn't need to be much. I mean, it's a simple 1% of your initial ask an investment fund going to open source software would make a huge difference. We saw that recently with the Handshake donation, which had $10 million going to free software projects. And this was a huge amount of money, which many free software projects had never seen before in their lives. So to make that something regular and something new, we'll be able to put things on a firm footing. It will be able to pay developers to actually work on this stack that people is using, rather than just relying on people's goodwill and doing it in their spare time.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You mentioned that. Now, we have a few people presenting through the next 3 weeks, so through the month of June, from different community backgrounds and aspects, talking about things like good citizenship of corporates contributing to communities, how communities work, etc. We have a break in August after we cover hardware, software, hardware and data. And then we start to look at the commercial models around open, or organizational models, revenue generation around open. And we then tip towards some of these companies that you're talking about, maybe a little bit more established. We have Rancher and we have Nextcloud committed to come in and talk to us about running open source based corporates and how to manage your models, licensing, that kind of thing. The thread has now got people buzzing because you've mentioned Tidelift, and our friend Luis Villa, who presented to us back in February, our last face-to-face event before the whole pandemic, and that we should bring Luis in. I don't know if you've seen, I saw something last week where they're actually undertaking a survey of contributors. So there's a survey out with a lot of developers asking them about their contributions. So that could be an interesting topic for us, definitely. And Tidelift has this model where they look at paying the maintainers. I wonder if there's a need for something bigger, Neil, where we don't just look at the maintainers, but the creators. When you're talking about these startups, how do we get funding into organizations who are creating essential code and maintaining that essential code without charging a license fee? I think we may need to look at some creativity around that.
Yeah,
now,
absolutely.
Andrew, I think you wanted to ask a question. Do you want to jump in?
It wasn't a question, it's an observation, which I know that anyone who's giving a talk, oh no, not somebody with an observation. So do shut me up. I'll try.
So why are you doing it then, Andrew Katz?
Well, I only put something in chat, so presumably that's the reason why you wanted me to come in on this. So the point is that Neil makes about support for projects, I think is a really important one. And I was giving a talk to the Finos people a while ago, and they're an open source organization that's focused very much on the finance industry. And one of the things that I think is quite important, is often overlooked, is that there's several regulatory regimes that require organizations that are under those regimes to look at risk management in a sort of fairly broad way. And as lawyers, for example, we're also required to look at risks to the business as a whole. And I think a very significant business, as Neil correctly says, is something like, what happens if you're relying on encryption technology and you have something like the Heartbleed bug, and you've just got a small bunch of people who are maintaining that. So this is, and I'm going to mention OpenChain because every time I talk, I have to mention OpenChain. But OpenChain is a good tool to help organizations manage open source risk. And one of the reasons that there is a specific requirement under OpenChain to have a policy regarding community engagement is to focus people's minds on the idea that community engagement is important for a number of reasons, but one of those is risk mitigation as well. So what I'm trying to do is to encourage people to think about involvement from that perspective. It is a sort of a softly approach. I mean, I've already had a number of clients who've approached me, and they want to look at open source compliance mainly from an IP risk perspective, and then it moves on to the idea of a security perspective, and it's because they're being pressed by their regulators to look at sort of broad risks as well. And I think now is the time when we really need also to continue to press this idea that making sure that the projects that you're reliant on are also taken into account, and therefore need to be appropriately funded. And I'm a great fan of the Tidelift model. I think it's essentially a way of democratizing the Red Hat model that has worked spectacularly well. If you're a shareholder in Red Hat, you're not going to disagree with that. And I think Tidelift is a way of sort of democratizing that process so that it can cover other projects as well. And when we get more transparency in terms of exactly how much of the revenue gets fed back to the maintainers, that would be helpful. But I know that Lewis is working on that. So yeah. My question is, does that make sense to you, Neil? Do you agree?
Yes, it's a short version. I mean, could you imagine if you were a large bank and you went to your boss and say, hey, I want to deploy this software over here, but yeah, it's totally free and there's no support and it might stop working tomorrow and no one cares about it. You'd get laughed out of the office. But that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
If you happen to pay, say, if you went in and say, hey, we'll pay $3,000 for a license fee, but it still probably doesn't come with any support, then that seems more acceptable. I mean, it's a place that we need to rely on. There is no way that people who build stuff on top of the whole of open source software can maintain that entire stack themselves. Therefore, it is important to either pay for a support contract or to get involved with free software communities and to support them, because that's where your support is coming from. And you can reach those upstream authors and the people who wrote the code to be able to talk about and to be able to fix the bugs or introduce those features you'd like, and you get to do that. But it involves that community engagement and involves supporting those projects. And otherwise, you're building on a house of cards.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we're talking about Tidelift because we, as a group, and many of us know Lewis. Tidelift's a great example. I think it was the first and probably the best funded, so very, very public in what they're doing. And I think their model in many ways replicates what Red Hat does with a subscription. You buy a particular subscription which allows you a sort of certified version of the code you're using. And in return for that, you receive the maintenance that Neil's talking about, the support that Neil's talking about. There are other models that we're seeing emerge as well around that area of sort of pay the maintainer. I know one example is Open Teams, where they have I believe, a marketplace infrastructure where people who need, they've got an itch they want scratched or something that needs done for their business on a particular piece of code, can go in and that will be matched. That request will be matched against the developer who's willing to do that work, or against someone who can provide maintenance for it. So I think there's quite a lot going on in that area. There's the Roads and Bridges report from a year or two ago, which is also worth reading around that. I thought it was pretty weighty. And I think that was it Forbes Foundation that supported that, I think. But that's definitely worth the look. Sammy, I can see that you're asking some things there, and Steve also. Steve, do you want to go first since you were ahead of Sammy? Do you want to ask Neil your question? No, Steve doesn't seem to have appeared. Sammy, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Really good sort of presentation. It's sort of an observation along the same lines as Andrew. I totally agree. I think we need to change the mindset that utilizing open source is for free. In terms of having a clear policy in an organization, we're very great supporters of Open Chain. I think one of the questions that we ask our developers, okay, so what is your long-term plan with regards to the project that you're creating? How are you going to maintain this moving forwards? And again, ARM does quite a number of open source projects that we maintain ourselves, and that is part of the strategy and the process. And more importantly, how are you going to end of life a project? This is something that a lot of companies and organizations and projects out there, things die and are very widely used, but there is no clear maintenance. There's no clear sort of, this is the end of life. Not even at a basic level of actually letting people know that this is no longer supported. So that part of that policy and process that you put in place is to take that into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is another aspect to that as well, is companies are starting to get a little bit better at the concept of community building. Like I mentioned before, there's this concept that people are starting to get used to the idea that you can all work remotely and it's fine. Well, I guess over the last 3 months or so, people are starting to recognize that it's fine to work remotely, actually, and it is possible to do so. And so another interesting one is I think companies are starting to, and organizations are starting to learn why open source communities have the breadth and the innovation that it has. And it's not necessarily just to do with the license. The license is incredibly helpful because it allows you to build on things that have happened before. But the innovation that has come from open source software is not from it has a GPL or an Apache or a BSD license. That's almost irrelevant. It's on the way that you have people from all over the world with all different experiences, and that diversity of approaches that have come together that has really led to this new and novel approaches that have never been thought of before, and haven't come from a sort of traditional waterfall model.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I was involved in a sort of, before we went into lockdown, during one of the Linux Foundation conferences, I was involved in a discussion with the To-Do group, and I said, well, actually, you need to look at the general cost of a project, because again, there is particularly around organizations and companies, commercial companies, there is this sort of mindset that open source is free, whereas I actually think no, it isn't actually. It's just free for you because you have not invested in that development. So if you're utilizing open source, you need to invest in that maintenance and contribution back, spending engineering resource, and that is a cost that as an organization you need to take into account when deciding, yes, I would like to use this open source project.
Yes, absolutely.
I think that's interesting, and it's something. Dawn Foster is going to be joining us in a couple of weeks, and I think her talk is on good citizenship, on that very point of giving back. We did have an observation from Steve. Steve, I don't know if we're trying to unmute you. I don't know if it's worked. Do you want to?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, hurrah!
Sorry, I joined with audio only. I've not used this platform before. I was going to comment really more than a question. So I perhaps slightly differently to what lots of people on this channel seem to be. I'm a system administrator, storage administrator for a large UK university. And interesting, you mentioned the sort of like some of the unsupported nature of open source software. That's kind of what's driving the backbone of UK HPC and research right now. Yep. Interestingly, doing things like sequencing COVID-19 genomes, things like that, stuff that we've been involved in. So it's interesting to hear you mention that. What I was going to say was, last night I watched a BCS organized talk, where, as I posted in the chat, Carlos Moltzan, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce his name, he was one of the mentors of the guy who developed Ceph, which is a sort of enterprise or web scale object storage system. And his talk was very interesting because a lot of what he talked about was how they were able to use that as a catalyst to get investment and engagement back into open source. And as part of that, as part of that investment that they got, they set up things like teaching students, PhD students, how to build open source communities and how to build that engagement and how to get that investment. So how you can keep the software product open source, but also get that money coming in from companies who are interested in using that product. And I thought that it was an interesting crossover with what you are, what you're saying about getting involvement in GNOME, getting people to invest in those kinds of software. This, essentially that idea that the software is freely available, but people's time needs to be paid for, etc., etc. I don't know if it's okay to post a link to that talk in here, which I can do because it looks like it's been uploaded to YouTube. So I will do that.
We work very closely with BCS and SCL, who've both been mentioned today, and promote each other's events. So absolutely, please do. And it's lovely to have a sysadmin join us.
I'll also,
if we'd known that earlier, your bearing would have been being picked as well as Neil's.
I'll also leave a link in there for the thing I have a week on Thursday as well for people who want the inside track as to what happened at the patent case in a few more details.
As you're talking about the patent case, I have a bit of responsibility here where I'm working with the lawyers from Sherman and Sterling who represented GNOME pro bono to put an article together, which will be done with a bit of luck. It will be online in the next week or so through Jolts. It just depends on the editing process. And it's their inside track on the patent litigation, and in many ways something that could be used as a model for others if they encounter the same problems.
Absolutely.
I doubt very much that would be from Rothschild, but you never know. I think you finished them off, Neil.
Yeah, and the whole point about what we were trying to do was also to send a message that you don't go over after open source software. It's just not worth it. If you found you've accidentally do it, say sorry, give them some money, and go away again, because they will try it. Because they will always fight on principle.
Just we made a very small donation as OpenUK to the Fighting Fund, but tell everybody how many people and how much money you raised.
Yeah, so it was quite fantastic actually. So within about a week, we'd raised over $140,000, and that was from over 4,000 people. And it was the vast majority was from individuals as well. It does show that of what you can achieve when you do this. I mean, to actually fully defend a patent case, it's about $10 million. So we were, so we were very lucky that we had Sherman and Sterling working pro bono for us as well, which was fantastic.
So that I will share details amongst this group and beyond as the Jolts Journal of Open Law Technology and Society article comes out with the inside track from the lawyers.
I think it, especially for lawyers or anyone out there with an interest in IP litigation, it's a really interesting story about our approach and how we went about it and the outcome we got. It's not a standard litigation or the way we went about some of it.
I think that's very true. Neil, from my personal perspective, thank you very much both for your work for OpenUK and doing this today. I'm going to disappear off and let Katie wrap things up, but thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just to echo Amanda there, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. It's been really, really interesting, and hopefully we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time at the SCL talk as well. Next week we've got Jonathan Riddell talking about KDE is all about the apps next Friday. So hopefully we'll see quite a few people there next week. Have a lovely weekend, everyone.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.